Hey, all you Ethicuties. Welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you think changing our workplaces can change our world, I am so excited to be back on the Ethicsverse. I've spent the last, 6-8 weeks, it seems like 8 weeks, in a prison staring at a ceiling fan. This is my first day back into the wild. So I'm super excited to be here. We have a phenomenal episode with it for you guys today. Risk-proofing your enterprise. I needed to risk-proof my driving skills, so I'm going to get some nice learnings from this into my own life. For those of you who haven't heard, I got into an accident about a month or two ago, and new lease on life. I am feeling good. I appreciate all the notes and all the messages and all the texts. It really is, I spend so much time talking about this amazing community that we're a part of, and I really got to see that community really step up for me, and it's been very humbling, and it's been a real perspective shift for me. So I'm sure I'll be talking about this for the rest of my life, but I appreciate you all who have been with me on this journey. So let's dive in. We have a phenomenal show for you today. I'm going to blast through a couple of these announcements, and we're going to dive right in. Real quick, real round of applause for Gio, though. My gosh, he stood in here for the last few weeks, really crushed it on the Ethicsverse. We kept the show alive, and it's because of all of you. And we take very serious the hour you guys spend with us every week here. And we really want to make this value add and just appreciate Gio. So thousands of emojis for Gio would be phenomenal right now, and I will convey that to him as well. We have the FTI consulting, survey coming out. So if you guys have not hit that survey, there should be a link on the console there. Take 5 minutes and blast through that right now. You're going to be entered in to win a prize because we love giving away prizes, and you'll also get all the results before anyone else. All the folks who did this last year and this thing that came out, this report that came out was super insightful, and there's a lot of opportunity from those insights to leverage more impact inside your organization, whether that's getting more headcount, getting more budget, and so forth. So take 5 minutes if you care about this community, which you should, and give us your thoughts on that survey. Okay, so find that link. Maybe, Joe, you can drop into, we're already up to almost 1,200 emojis. I love this. See, I'm so happy to be back. I cannot tell you enough. Joe, maybe you can drop throughout the conversation, drop that FTI link. Socials, podcasts, books, we love to learn here at the Ethicsverse. So click this QR code and you're going to be, you can see all of our favorite podcasts, all of our favorite books. This book list continues to grow. And as always, we love giving away books on the Ethicsverse. We're going to give 5 away today. And we're also going to give another 5 away for those of you who can share your insights from the Ethicsverse. So I'll tell you the title here in a second, but share on social media. We want to really grow this community more because this is such a great asset that we all have, our ability to share our insights with each other, to meet up every single week. And our jobs can be very lonely, and to be able to meet up every single week and not carry the weight of the world on our shoulders can help us really have a lot more impact in changing our little corner of the world. The ethics experts last week was phenomenal. We got the one and only Adam Hunt. He was from Netflix. He's built a great program over there. They have a really interesting culture. So if you haven't checked out this episode yet, I would highly encourage it. And another new announcement, you guys have requested this. It's coming. We're going to convert the Ethicsverse into a podcast as well. So you'll be able to hear the audio from all the past episodes and all the episodes going forward because we love you so much, huh? All right. Tuesday, if you haven't signed up for this yet, this is the Agora Awards. So this is the Podcast Network Awards. If you don't follow the Podcast Network, you should. Tom Fox puts out a ton of great thought leadership. Matt Kelly, the one and only, is on several of those podcasts. If I sound smart, I probably stole something from Matt. You know that already. But there's going to be a really fun award show next Tuesday, the 19th. It starts at noon Eastern. So hit this QR code here and sign up for that. It's, of course, free. And there's going to be some really cool awards. And it's all going to be coming together to honor the great women in compliance, Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley, the original OGs. That podcast is alive and well. Hema Lomax is on there now with Lisa Fine, along with those other ladies, Sarah Haddon and Ellen Hunt. But there's going to be a great award show. So I really hope you guys can come. I will be hosting live in effect. And then next month, early in next month, we have the Resility Conference in New York. So if you're in the New York area and you want to pop by, look at all these people that are coming. You got Ron Carucci, you got everybody on there. So there's going to be a ton of great sessions. Hit this QR code and we got a discount there for you. I think it's 10% off if you just put my name, just kidding, put Ethico 10 in that box and you're going to get 10% off. So highly recommend that you come. There's going to be a lot of great thought leadership, a lot of great, networking if you're in the New York area. I want to share one more thing. We're giving away this book. Here's the spoiler. We're giving away Hema and Ashley's book, The Art of Ideation for Culture Building. In this book, I didn't pay for this, okay, this is authentic. In this book, they call out the manager toolkit. So we put together this phenomenal manager toolkit. It's free, and it has a ton of resources for you to really attack this middle layer, which is really where the battleground is. People are 6 to 8 times more likely to go to their middle manager than they are to engage in your anonymous hotline and those other channels that you have. So we have to activate those people if we're going to continue to crowdsource that risk intelligence at scale and provide insights back to the point of risk. So take advantage of those resources. There should be a link on the thing as well. Or you can scan this amazing QR code here and download this thing. There are tons of, there's a white paper in there. There's a ton of extra resources that you can use to really drive this culture of integrity forward. That's where our battleground is into this next phase that we're stepping into. Speaking of stepping into a new phase, we got the ecosystem, which is raging. So this is too small for me to read, but this is just a little bit of a taste. You guys should zoom in, take a screenshot of this. This is a little bit of the taste of how the Ethico difference can help folks in the ethics and compliance departments really drive that culture of integrity forward, really get their eyes, drive more engagement from their stakeholders, analyze risk in a better way, and ultimately demonstrate a culture of compliance. That's really what the DOJ is talking about, and that's what we're all striving toward. So if you're interested in the ecosystem, you ought to be. Come and check it out. Almost 2,000 emojis. Here's this book. If you haven't gotten it yet, you should be participating big time today, dropping your questions, dropping your insights in the chat as we talk about blending enterprise risk management with governance, risk, and compliance. And we're going to be giving away 5 plus 5. So 5 from the chat, from those of you who are here, and 5 from LinkedIn. If you're going to be sharing some insights from today, tag Ethico, hashtag the Ethicsverse, or tag me. So that's 5 plus 5. That's 10. That's just that quick math coming from me. Okay, Promised Land promotion. I'm going quick here. Promised Land promotion. We're giving away a year free 15% discount if you are coming from Navex or you're coming from Convergence or OneTrust. So if you feel like you're struggling with a tool that hasn't been updated in a while, if you feel like there's a ton of manual process, if you feel like you're not getting the engagement from your workforce because you know there's a ton of risk intelligence out there that you're not getting, if you feel like you just don't have a good partnership with your vendor, we're here for you. So we love you. Hit this QR code here. You can schedule a demo. If you schedule a demo by the end of the year, that is going to be your key to the Promised Land. And that Promised Land is full of milk and honey, okay? Now over to Coolest Guy in Compliance. One more round of applause for Gio. Thank you so much, Gio, for running the show while I've been gone. And a big round of applause for Matt Kelly, the Coolest Guy in Compliance. Matt, how's it going, buddy?
It's going very well, Nick. Thank you very much. Welcome back. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. So today we are talking about challenges around GRC and ERM, 2 of the acronyms that this industry throws around a lot. And we want to talk about how they are different, how they are complementary, and how compliance officers in particular can help their senior management take a more risk-aware approach to business operations, as opposed to management coming up with their bright strategy without ever thinking about compliance or risk management and then telling you, you go deal with it, and you cleaning up the consequences of them acting alone. How can we get ahead of that? How can compliance officers bring the right sort of information to the board? That's the stuff we want to talk about today. We have 2 other very good guests with us. We do have Nick, as always. I like my new AI image, by the way. I kind of look like Mark Zuckerberg, but I'll let that stop. So first joining us is James Rose. So James is a longtime GRC thinker. He has been a corporate audit executive in his past and a chief audit executive. These days, he is in charge of Sunhawk Consulting, which is a GRC advisory firm. James, welcome. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Glad to help with the conversation.
And also joining us is Melissa Musser. Melissa is with GRF Advisory, which is a CPA and advisory firm. And Melissa has been another longtime audit and GRC professional who helps a lot of client companies think through what their challenges are. Melissa, glad to have you here too.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
All right. And then as always, everybody who's listening, we always love your comments and your chats. I see that already there's a bunch of comments floating around, but if you do have questions that we are about what we're talking about, feel free to pop them into the chat anytime, and we will try to get to your questions as soon as possible, or at least get to them at the end, maybe in the last 10 minutes in the Q&A. All of that said, I wanted to start with this kickoff question, basically like defining what we're even talking about here. What is the problem? People use these acronyms such as GRC and ERM quite a lot. They can also be a bit abstract. So I first wanted to clarify in plain terms, what is the disconnect between upper management and the compliance function that we should be worrying about? James, I'll go to you first, and then Melissa, and then Nick. But why are we here?
Well, I think you led off with the answer, the acronyms. So if we're using acronyms from a compliance standpoint or a governance standpoint, and management isn't involved in those, or using those every day, they're going to be lost. And so management's thinking about what's our strategy, how do we focus on that strategy and stay focused on it and say no to everything else. And so, our conversation has to be about how can we help you execute on that strategy, and how can we make sure there are no surprises to get into your objectives. And so that's what the elevator pitch needs to be. And you leave out the acronyms, ERM, GRC, and then when you tease management into, if you will, getting interested in the conversation with how can I, the compliance official, help you have or limit surprises. And so once you get to that point, you've got them engaged in the conversation, then you can talk about how we're going to do that. And that's when you get into ERM, the what, and GRC, the how, from my perspective.
Okay.
I give the first time I got a GRC, implementation in a large, for-profit, SEC traded company. I had to take a couple of bites at the apple. The first time I said, we need it for Sarbanes-Oxley, and they're like, no. And we need it for enterprise risk management. They're like, no. And then I said, well, we can manage, the compliance risk that we've got with our large government payer. And they're like, oh, yeah, we want one of those. We know it's the same thing. And so it's finding the words that resonate with your management team.
Okay. And Melissa, how would you characterize the problems here and the tensions?
Well, it's interesting because in 2018-19, both of the ISO risk management framework and then COSO ERM both got revamped. And the big core part of that was strategy. Right? Putting strategy in the middle. That was the big emphasis there. And so when we think about risks, we really need to be thinking at it from the strategic objectives, right? And then I think it was in 2020, the IIA, the 3 lines model was the 3 lines of defense, right? And now it's just the 3 lines model, and they updated that. So when you think about it, it's we're not really on defense so much, but we're on offense. So really framing it in that perspective and thinking about how we can be more proactive. And ERM kind of helps build that into the culture of an organization. So I see that as somewhat of a difference, but more just a movement in that direction.
Okay. And Nick, give me your thoughts here too, because I'm hearing an awful lot about how compliance officers can add value to senior management, but it is still a challenge to, I guess, frame it in a way that they can see the picture or speak their language, whatever the metaphor is. But what do you think about some of these disconnects that exist?
Well, I think James kind of hit the nail on the head that what we're really kind of talking about is increasing expected value for whatever the investment is, right? The company at some level is just an investment. And so what we are trying to do is decrease the unintended outcomes, right? We're trying to de-risk the organization and increase that expected value. And I think that's going to come through a number of different ways. If we're talking about GRC and ERM though, I think that, I think GRC is sort of a framework. It's sort of like the house. And I think of ERM as a component within that framework. It's a very important room within the house. And I think many times we get caught up in these, I don't know, I'm kind of a big reductionist. I just think we're all kind of talking about one thing. We're talking about de-risking an investment. We're de-risking an organization so that that thing can perform better and achieve whatever mission that it is trying to achieve in a faster, more effective, more efficient way. And so that always comes down to de-risking and driving waste out of any kind of a system we're talking about. And an organization is just sort of a fractalized bunch of stacked systems. And so I think sometimes we end up getting wrapped around the axle, drawing these inconsequential lines between these different acronyms. Back to Melissa's point, it's really about how do we play both offense and defense at the same time to broaden our impact and ultimately improve the achievement of that mission.
Okay. And I did want to ask a couple of questions about how all of this looks from, say, the board's perspective or senior management's perspective, because I don't think it's correct to say they don't care about compliance and they don't care about compliance risk. I'm sure they do. However, I'm not necessarily clear on how they care about it, or if they are caring about it in the right way. That maybe they see it as an afterthought, but the better approach would be to sort of risk adjust your strategy from the start, something like that. James, give me your thoughts on that point. Like, how is the board seeing it? Because ultimately, you're going to have to meet them there and then guide them to a better place. So where is their starting point?
Well, the way you preference the question is that it's the same for all. So the first thing you've got to do is step back, and for your individual board, where are they on that journey? If we're talking about a mature organization, or they just happen to have a stakeholder in the room on the board that is very driven by ethics and compliance and knowing what our ethical boundaries are, then you can play from that. If they really are thinking, they're more just focused on the bottom line, and you've got to think and bring into the conversation, how do we manage risk, or how do we manage surprises? Then that's a different journey you're going to be on. And so I think of it from two different aspects of ethics and our patient or customer, safety, those things which we can all agree to, versus regulatory constructs, which at times we're like, why does that regulation exist? You think of like an Uber or some of these other large, multinationals that, they plowed over some regulatory requirements in certain jurisdictions in order to drive a new business model. And so, that's one component versus a safety matter, which they, work to get their arms around, being more and more deliberate about safety in the vehicle and be able to reach out to if there's a concern about, the driver or something like that. So those are different dynamics. And so you have to think about where is the board, your governance organization, and what they care about. And then, as I said, drive into that and think about where the surprises that they're okay with versus they're not. And what are the regulatory constructs that, what's the basis behind that regulation? And how do I advocate to maybe move it if that's the case? So it's a complex dynamic. You have to think about all these components as you're thinking about how to help the organization.
That kind of leads into another question. Melissa, you and I were chit-chatting about this just before we started about, the board is supposed to set risk appetite, risk tolerance. And I wonder, A, do they actually do that well? And B, could somebody kind of explain the difference between these two things? Because yet again, we're at some esoteric terms that get thrown around a lot. And I'm not sure everybody understands what they look like in real practical terms. But Melissa, what would you say about how management and the board are defining what their risk priorities are and what their risk appetites and everything else?
Yeah, and every board is going to be different and have different contexts. So I always like to start with, your board's probably going to know what what their top objectives are, let's say 5 to 10 objectives. And then if you were to turn around and say, okay, well, you've gotten consensus on that. So then what are the top 5 to 10 risks? And if I went around and asked everybody that, would they all have different opinions, or would they be in line just like they're all in line with their strategy, right? And I think that's the first problem that ERM can help solve, is that ERM provides a methodology to come up with consensus on what are our top risks, right? And then, from there, compliance officers can then either tailor that compliance risk to either the strategies, the strategic objectives, or those top risks that have been identified. And now we're all speaking the same kind of language taxonomy on how significant that is or how it structures into that. And then from there, you've got this risk appetite, risk tolerance kinds of discussions, because I think you and I were talking, without that, I think a compliance officer is going to assume zero tolerance for any kind of compliance. You know what I mean? And so when we start to define, in order to achieve this objective, we're willing to, forego certain things and really working to define that. And it is a very difficult thing to do, and it needs to happen at the board level. Like, what are our guardrails? I think in terms of I think the best way to explain it simply is to think about a bank. And a bank, they're really good at risk appetite, risk tolerance, because maybe they won't loan to someone if they don't meet these certain thresholds. So if you take those same types of concepts, but then apply it to your own business concept, that's when you start to develop certain kinds of guardrails that need to be defined. And that would be very useful for compliance officers, or really anyone, to really understand, where can we go with this, or even from a cybersecurity perspective, because obviously that would influence the budget. It influences so many different things within the organization. So again, it starts at the top within governance and really, getting that good direction from what the board kind of expects from compliance officers.
I used to work for a guy that was like wildly wealthy, okay? And his son also worked there. And this guy was like the idiot prince, okay? The son. And he had a ton of money. And I mean, this was out of like a sitcom. But like he would notoriously park in handicap spots. And I was driving with him to lunch one time, and I kind of asked him about it. And he said, well, yeah, if I get fined, that's just like how much it costs to park there. And this is kind of in response to what Eric said. Eric said, hey, Eric, this is a great comment. He said, a lot of boards don't care. They just run the math. Properly run, they do this math. Properly run and fund GRC cost is greater than the fine for not complying. So the board says, okay, we'll just pay the fine because it's less than the money spent on GRC. And I think there's some truth in it at some level, because to Melissa's point, it's very subjective, right? Like every board is going to have a different like tolerance for risk. Like I would never drive a motorcycle, especially after this thing. But there are other people that do. They ride a motorcycle and they take steps that they think are, safety measures. They'll wear a helmet, or they'll wear like, motorcycle gear, so that if like they're willing to take a risk that I'm not willing to take, but at that risk tolerance, they're doing things around that level of risk appetite that are trying to de-risk it. And so I would never park in a handicapped spot now that I'm sort of partially handicapped, but like this guy was willing to do it. And so his framework was like, look, that's just how much it costs to park here. And he was willing to do it because he had money falling out of his ears. So I think it's our job to not like necessarily impose our risk tolerance on those folks that we're serving, because we serve at the, whatever they say, like we serve at their, pleasure, whatever, but rather get a clear picture of what that risk appetite is and move that stuff incrementally. I just think it's very subjective, and it's often in the eye of the beholder. And if we come in and we say, well, it's all zero, we would never want to get a fine, or we would never want to do those things, whether it's right or wrong is sort of a different sort of question. I'm just saying, in actuality, if Eric's right about this math that folks are doing, we need to get a clear picture of like how those variables in that multivariate equation that is their risk management approach are weighted.
Hold on. I want to pick up on that comment and idea. And James, let me put this question to you, because I see where that comment from the attendee, Eric, is going, and he's not wrong. There are some companies who think that way. But at the same time, I also think that can be very short-sighted. You could have a minimal cybersecurity and privacy program, and then it's not that there's going to be a compliance fine, but an operational disruption that suddenly you can't ship goods for 3 weeks. That's going to be a huge hit financially and everything else. And so I wonder how compliance officers can get a grasp on the true cost of poor risk management and then bring it to the board to say, well, here's, how your thoughts about risk could cost the company. Now let's try and have a risk-adjusted strategy or risk-adjusted business model to take all these things into account. It's kind of easy to paint a darker picture with compliance risks, but I think there's an awful lot of operational risks too, or risks that I don't know if they're operational or compliance, but I don't think that the damage cares what label you put on it. So, I mean, how can compliance officers think more sharply about risk and the potential consequences? They get better data on it to have better conversations and kind of address those points, like what Eric, the attendee, had brought up. James, what would you say?
Well, I mean, you got to first start back, and I'm going to go back to where I started, where thinking about the organization's strategy and what it's trying to achieve with its customer base or patients. So if you think about safety or an outcome or reputation, you start from that, and that becomes something that you want to protect at all costs, or at least at some level. And so you're going to invest in what are the operational controls or compliance controls around that construct, regardless of what the actual regulation says. Then you get into the point about, okay, but I may be satisfying what my customer wants, but breaking a regulation. And so that's where I think that dynamic comes in of, well, what's talk to me about the nature of the regulation. Is it that we're trying to purposely avoid it, which is one thing, or is we're trying to be accommodate the regulation, but how much money am I going to spend on that? And there's no such thing as zero tolerance, because I cannot spend enough money to be perfect at all times, regardless of what the construct is. So how much am I going to invest to meet that regulation that my customer may not care about? And where is the line where I'll take a couple of hiccups if they occur, versus looking in the rearview mirror when issues occur and someone commits fraud or someone's purposely doing something to harm my customers or patients. Hopefully I have zero tolerance for that. I'm going to go after that. I'm going to take that, that down and deal with it. But proactively, in terms of foresight and insight, I'm trying to balance what the organization's, true concerns and caring about our patients and customers are going to be. And then how do I wrap myself around that in terms of the strategic objectives? Again, it's somewhat case specific. Like in the handicap situation, if you just think about it from a regulatory standpoint, how often am I going to get, fined? And then is there a spot, is this like I pulled in, there's only one handicap spot, or they're like 10 and they're all open, right? Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is just the ethical construct of I'm taking up somebody's spot that's actually handicapped. So, those are different dynamics to walk through. And so some organization would say, I'm never going to do that because I'm talking about patient safety or a patient or consumer issue, versus the other construct. It's more about what's the regulatory impact.
Melissa, what would you say about these challenges around quantifying the risks to be able to help the board and senior management understand how they should treat it? And it's interesting because James had said, what do you want to protect at all costs? Well, if you want to protect it at all costs, it doesn't matter how much it costs. But most issues, the company doesn't really want to protect it at all costs. So we need to know what the cost is for whether it's a compliance risk or a regulatory risk, a reputation risk, operational failure. And somebody somewhere in the business has to try and put a number on that threat. So where do you see companies trying to solve it and doing that well? Or what are the obstacles to try and do it? Like, how are they going to get their heads around what is the number to be able to go and then focus management's mind on, here's why we should care about it?
Right. It's really helpful to have like an ERM playbook, or it kind of defined, and then you have all of the different categories and perspectives, such as injury and harm, or its reputation damage, media coverage, and you have all the different categories, operational, and then there's kind of a agreed upon methodology to be assessing risk in addition to financial analysis to kind of figure that out. And so you have the way to rank the risk, but then you have to tie it to an objective. So when you're talking to a board member, it has to be, okay, here's our strategy and this is where we're going. And then when you rank that risk, whether you use the heat map, the risk category, maybe it's cybersecurity, and of course there's compliance issues embedded within that, and there's going to be a lot of different, and this is where you break down those silos, right? And so let's say cybersecurity is number one. It's been ranked number one risk across the board. In all the surveys and crystal balls looked at, so I have to just assume that's a risk, right? So you've got a major risk of cybersecurity. Hopefully you have a risk owner that's assigned to that, and then there's a handling plan that everyone has a seat at the table, and compliance officers are going to have a seat at the table for that compliance plan. And so when you see that, okay, cybersecurity is a big risk, we need to invest in this, and this is what these procedures are going to do, you can kind of start to see it more holistically and how it affects the entire organization. So now you're not speaking and representing from just a silo, but you're representing an already identified top risk, and within that handling plan, this is what could go wrong, and this is what we should be doing, and this is how it affects the entire organization. So it's like bringing it all together, but then tying it back to a strategic objective. I think that's the disconnect. Yeah. And if you can speak their language and flip it on its head, I think that's really important. And then when we're talking about enterprise risk management, we're also talking about seizing opportunities. So you could also sell it as this is this could be a strategic imperative. What if we are so secure with cybersecurity and so compliant, it becomes an asset to our organization. And they're going to want to work with us because they know your data is secure and that we've invested in this. And now this is part of your strategic advantage. And that's another way that I like about ERM, because it makes you think about the opportunity about that investment as well. And I think boards like to talk strategy, more than they like to talk risk.
Yeah, they like upside.
Yeah,
they like expansion. They want to get it bigger. They want to make more money. Like that's what they're talking about for sure.
I guess one question I also have then is the compliance officer the right person to have these conversations? Or do you more often see that it is a chief risk officer, assuming a company even has a chief risk officer? And I think a lot of non-financial companies do not. Or is there a legal officer, or does the CEO hijack this and they're the ones who talk to the boards? Like James and then Melissa, what do you see in practice about, we're all assuming the chief compliance officer is having these conversations. Is that the case, James?
Well, it definitely should be, but there are a lot of compliance officers that are not. They're looking at transactional issues, conflict of interest or other things, which when you get into reporting to the board, a lot of times it's just not material from the C-suite's perspective. And so, the reality is we all should be talking the language to the C-suite and the board, and then within that language, teasing out, well, how are we helping advance the organization's strategy? So just as Nick and Melissa have been talking about, it's all about the bottom line for the board, and how do we help with that within the construct of a regulatory framework or a risk management framework? What are the things that they're not aware of? The Institute of Internal Auditors just rewrote, the whole global audit standards. And the only thing they really changed in the purpose statement of internal auditing, they add the word foresight. Auditors ought to be, compliance officials ought to be focused on foresight. How do we look forward and anticipate things that can go wrong, and then put that in a context of how that relates to the board's strategy? So we can't be crying wolf on every little thing, but how do we actually put together real world examples that are happening out in other organizations, or that we can identify within our organization that are a lot of times we talk about small misses, and then how they can become bigger misses. Whenever we were doing our audit work, a lot of times when we had a big hiccup, we could go find a smaller, similar hiccup in the organization. Say, if we control for this differently, monitor it differently, we can stay ahead of those surprises, as I mentioned before, that we're trying to avoid. So the compliance officer definitely ought to be driving these conversations. And then what you want to do to calibrate is, if I have a chief risk officer, how am I matching what he's talking about or helping support that? If I don't, then maybe I'm the lead on it. If I've got a chief auditor, how do I help work with them in terms of the messaging? If my CEO is on point on these topics, I certainly don't want to steal his thunder or his or her thunder. So how do I help support that?
Melissa, what would you say, especially around who is actually having these conversations with the board? And does, to James's point, is it the compliance officer, or if it's not, how do you align with the chief risk officer, or I don't know, chief legal officer, something like that? Like, what do you see out there as sort of common practice about what compliance officers are really doing and who are boards really talking to?
Right. So I'm an internal auditor, right, at heart. I love the IIA, and so I just did a session on how to audit ERM. And so we were talking about that, looking at a lot of different examples. And one of the first things you need to look at is the structure. How is it getting communicated? How is information flowing, right? And so that's like step one. What type of information? How often? And what we found is it almost doesn't matter where it sits, as long as it's getting done. But there are guardrails you need to put to protect, to make sure that it isn't siloed. Like, so, even a CFO could, report. Someone's got to do it, depending on how big an organization is. And what we found is sometimes it's best to even have formed a risk council, to which the chief risk officer, compliance officer can be the chair of that council in order to gain those diverse perspectives and then report out. But it's important not to be overly focused on compliance if you want to do ERM, but then you get a more holistic perspective, and you can have lots of different folks on that council, and that's where ERM starts to come in, and you break those silos down, and it enables those conversations. And I'm talking about a management level risk council, because the board could also have a delegated risk committee as well that you might be reporting into. So there's all different kinds of variations there. But I think that's like a really key perspective on it. But someone needs to be doing it. And if it's not currently being done, then yes, it probably is your job to be doing it. So then you probably need to kind of put together, what's this going to look like? What's the methodology? And I would strongly urge you to consider forming some kind of management level committee where you all can share ideas and mitigation strategies and whatnot.
Okay.
The best compliance people that I know are business people first. And so like this,
Right.
James said this in his first answer. So much of our job is a framing exercise. So much of our job is putting a risk that I see as important into terms that make you believe that it's important. That's a sales exercise. And I think when we're selling, people buy from people they like, right? So when we're selling an idea. They have to buy that idea. They're going to buy from someone that they like. And I like you if you like me and you're like me. So if we can be a business person and show ourselves to be business people to the board or to the CEO or to whoever's endorsement we need, I think that's the first place to start. And I would just kind of go on to say, like, who better than you? Who is in a better position than you to have the impact the business needs? Like, it's you. So whether your predecessor was in a box or not, or whether these conversations are typically done by the risk officer or whatever, like, I think it's on us to burst out of those boxes and like be the change that we want to see in the world. I know it sounds a little bit trite, but like, who better than you? You have insights that other people don't have. You have access to the circulatory system throughout the organization that a lot of other people who are way more siloed than you are have. And, use it as your duty, use it from an opportunistic standpoint, but use it to take some kind of an action that can kind of break the mold and drive the change that you need to make forward in the organization.
So next question I wanted to ask was, we've talked an awful lot about out on a whiteboard, it would look like you're doing a lot. You have to define the objectives. You have to match risks to the objective and make sure each risk has a risk owner. I'm just wondering, how much is this a technology problem? Because if you are doing all of the matching and tracking and whatnot manually, clearly that's a recipe for disaster, especially for large companies. But I don't know if compliance officers have successfully built the technology wherewithal and capabilities to be able to do this at scale, or to be able to do it constantly and reliably quarter after quarter. So are there just some practical block and tackle challenges like that for compliance officers? James, I'll ask you first, and then Melissa, like what's the tech angle to this?
Well, and it depends on the type of compliance that you're dealing with. So if you've got an audit group, guys, as Melissa, I'm an auditor at heart. And so you think about financial controls and all the ticking time and what your external auditor wants. And so generally, you've got some sort of technology that helps the organization just track those specific key controls financial wise and make sure they're in place. And so if you take that siloed, then that, by definition, it's off on its own, not adding a lot of added value other than getting that external auditor, happy. And so if you take that from a GRC perspective, how will these overlap with an operational thing that I want to make sure happens to satisfy our customers? How does it help in terms of a compliance or regulatory construct I want to make sure happens and happens well? Or there's a regulatory construct which really impacts my financial statements. I want to make sure that's done well. And so, the technology should really be helping to back to, as we start out, how do we help the business first? And so if I can be that business leader and there's a way to be more efficient from a business standpoint with the technology, because I've got all these people, frontline staff, middle managers having to do X, Y, and Z. They got all these things coming at them. If I can help with guiding the technology, which helps track the things that they're supposed to be doing, and tie that into my, risk framework, that's going to help. Now, you let off the question, should the compliance officer be driving this? So then that's a matter of, am I the only one in the room that's thinking about GRC and how to apply the technology? Then maybe I'm the guy that's going to drive it. If I can, saddle up with the chief internal auditor or the risk officer and use the technology that they're doing, that should be the thing I strive for. Or maybe it's with the CIO. Maybe they're already, you would think, on a journey of cybersecurity and all the things that need to happen. So they've got technology that maybe I can use in that construct to help with some of the more regulatory or other things I'm trying to accomplish. So you got to, again, you got to step back and look at where the organization is, from a maturity standpoint, and where all your partners are in this journey about being efficient with the business model.
Great point.
Melissa, give me your views on that too. And I'm still stuck on, you've got an awful lot of data in your enterprise that might be useful. You have to know where it is. Somebody has to be able to provide it to you. You might have to transform it into something a bit more useful for a risk and compliance function. Things are changing all the time. So how does technology help, or how much, when do you know that you're going to need help like that? Like, what could you tell us about the tech end of this?
I mean, I think tech could be incredible investment. So, definitely valuable. I think the maturity is a good point. You don't want to just jump in. You got to see where you are and where you are compared to your peers from a maturity assessment. And there are some models out there to benchmark yourself from an ERM maturity standpoint, and we do often see more mature organizations because garbage in, garbage out kind of perspective, right? You got to kind of have a handle on how do we define risk, because you don't want different users defining it differently. So you do got to go back to basics and have maybe a basic risk tolerance, basic definitions, then you can utilize that technology. And with technology, I think it's going to be amazing what we're going to be able to do and proactively find things, and maybe even link to strategies so that you can generate reports more easily for the board in ways that they can better digest the information. But I say absolutely a useful tool that every organization should be looking into, and hopefully there'll be more and more affordable options for organizations to be tapping into, but also more enterprise-wide type of integrations as well, as opposed to having all these separate types of technologies. And it's also really helpful for, global organizations. If you're starting to see issues arise in certain countries, those could represent risks in other ones, and just really being able to improve that communication to see trends that might be happening.
Nick, what do you think here? And, I'm especially intrigued by how compliance officers can systematize their capabilities and scale it up, because otherwise they're just going to get overwhelmed with so much information and too much noise. But what would you say?
I mean, the thing that I see most is that people are just not using their tech, or they're on a tool that's so old, that's so disjointed. Like, the best compliance departments, the best ethics teams that I see are this circulatory system. They're getting a bunch of risk intelligence and they're providing those insights back, which means they have access to pools of risk information that other departments don't have. And if they have a nice analytics overlay on that, and they can get that data in real time, well, then they can start to map that, right? Like, they can start to mitigate those risks because they have enough information that they're able to analyze and take action on. What I see most often is that they're kind of swimming in these pools. They're working in an old tool. They don't have that data at their fingertips. And in many cases, again, I'm not throwing any stones here. It's just the reality of where I'm at, or where we're at, which is really a lot of upside and a lot of opportunity for improvement. It's putting together reports, not for self, but for others. Oh, I have this committee meeting that's coming up, so I have to put this information together. We should be using that information to guide our own efforts. But it's really hard to do that when, again, the tech isn't working for you, or you've inherited a system that seems like too big to like unravel. Then we're just kind of like treading water. We're just trying to kind of keep our head above water. If ethics and compliance, and if GRC, and if ERM, and if all these things can really transform an organization and ultimately improve the bottom line and ultimately turn into a competitive advantage, well, then that means that like probably what got us here isn't going to get us there, and something has to change. Something has to be different. And so I get that it can be totally overwhelming, but I think we can't settle for the status quo. We have to settle for, or we have to make that like future state a reality. And usually it takes doing something a little bit different. And again, if we can get more of that risk intelligence, there's usually insights. If we're able to aggregate it more quickly or put a report together that's closer to our fingertips, we can usually take some action on it. And let me just add this other thing. Somebody asked, like, what does the board care about? I think the board cares about what Melissa said. They care about upside. They care about expansion. They care about having an angle. And what a lot of that is rooted in is some kind of an insight. So we have this huge opportunity because we have access to all this data. If we're, if the circulatory system is like flowing right, we have a ton of like potential energy, or a ton of potential like insight fodder available for us if we can just kind of pull some of that stuff together.
Yeah, and man, I want to emphasize a couple of points that Nick made. Definitely, when you think about, when we work with folks and the compliance officer says, I need a report that shows me A, B, and C. The first question I want to push back on is, well, what about your constituents, the board or others? What do they want to see? And so the tool's got to really be able to drive, to help the business first, the executives first with information. And then the second is pointed out, you got to invest the time in the tool and utilize it. There's so many folks that are not, that they think they're going to get a tool and it's going to presto help solve everything, but they don't invest the time, not just at setup, but ongoing to keep it useful and practical and updated.
So here's a question from the audience I wanted to read out and get your feedback. Melissa, I'll put it to you first, and then James, and then Nick. Question is, given that GRC emphasizes compliance to mitigate legal and reputational risks, while ERM focuses more broadly on strategic risks, how can organizations balance these approaches to ensure regulatory adherence and alignment with long-term objectives? Like, what strategies have you found successful for integrating compliance within a strategic risk management framework? Melissa, what would you say first, and then James?
Yeah, so when I first was, getting into ERM, they say ERM changes the culture of an organization. I'm like, what does that mean? And then it's like, I got more into it, and it's like, they use this phrase, everyone's a risk manager. That's ERM. So it's not like a separate department that owns risk, right?
Right.
Everyone owns risk. And so, when you think of, somebody on the front line or, someone trying to make sales, they're a risk manager too. It's not someone else's problem if they, have a compliance failure. It's their problem and they need to be held accountable. And I've seen organizations start to write in everyone's job description that you are responsible for risk. So the compliance officer, it's not just the compliance officer's responsibility, right? It's the culture of the organization. We're risk aware. Everyone knows the risk appetite, but we're all responsible. And I think that's kind of a big distinction there. And that actually helps compliance officers, come alongside and be there to help. So when there is a new strategy, they're a partner to say, okay, well, these are the risks we got to look out for. We got to look out for, not just me, but all of us need to look out for, So I think that's how it changes the culture and the perspective of the organization.
So I love that idea, although it is predicated, everyone is a risk manager, on you've got a strong corporate culture and you're giving people enough information to understand, okay, this risk right in front of me is what. And, companies can do that, although those are two critical elements for success in what you had just said there. James, what would you say to that original question about how you integrate thinking about compliance and managing compliance risk into a strategic risk management framework?
Well, building off the conversation there, how do you sit in front of those middle managers and help them understand what risk means and managing risk? It's one thing to put it into their job descriptions, it's another thing to expect them to execute it regularly. And so how do you have, those categories of risk, those things that can go wrong, with tailored to your organization and the specific dynamics, and kind of guide them to what like the board, senior management's expectations are around risk tolerance, not using that word, but in terms of what's acceptable or non-acceptable or what needs to be escalated if there's a problem. And so that is really the culture of enterprise risk management without saying those buzzwords. And so, how do you roll that out and have those ongoing conversations? And again, that's where the value of compliance officers really can have an impact when you're out meeting with your constituency, those middle line managers, those segment VPs, talking about how are we managing to make sure we're meeting our objectives without any surprises. And here's the things we need to do to make sure our staff are either proactively doing things to make sure the right things happen, or when they have an issue or a concern, they're comfortable and they're going to easily, readily raise their hand and ask for help. That's the culture we're trying to drive.
Nick, what would you say to this?
I think they're right. I think it's everybody's job. And I think if we're carrying the weight of the world on our shoulders, not only are we not going to be effective, but we're also going to be hard pressed to show what our true impact is. And, so much can change by kind of activating the culture. Everybody has it in, like we all have it in us. We're all wired for fairness. We're all wired for like risk aversion. We're all wired for like upside and like expansion, like all these base things that make a business great. And all these base things that like we're trying to like strive for, they're literally in every single person, like wired into their DNA. So it's really just about activating it and kind of turning it on a little bit. And again, a couple of whispers can start to really multiply into a chorus across an entire organization. So I think we're not trying to teach everybody Chinese or trying to teach everybody like ancient Aramaic. We're talking about activating something that's already within them and putting it in the context of like what they care about. There are risks within each department that correspond with each of those departments' mini mission, mini goals or mini purposes within the broader, mission of the organization. It's our job to activate those organs in the body, I think.
So here's another comment from an attendee trying to impersonate, I guess, a CFO when you go and you ask for more budget for, say, for a GRC tool. That CFO is probably going to say something like, well, Excel should be good enough. Excel can work closely with PowerPoint. You can use those. The software you're asking for is just not in the budget. We really need to keep an eye on spending. Somebody else then said emoji 100 in reply to that. So clearly this comment is sympathetic. It touches a lot of nerves. But I'm struck by that because I can kind of see the risk reward equation here. There's a lot of risk in using Excel spreadsheets and PowerPoint and Word documents and email to manage your risk. But the reward is probably going to be greater sales and lower costs right up until a disaster strikes, at which point you're going to stub your toe and fall flat on the company's face. And using Excel is what's going to get you there. But it's more like, you, the compliance person, have to have a conversation with the CFO or whomever about kind of like what I just said. We could do so much more on the upside if we move away from these, very rickety tools of desktop spreadsheets and Word and email and all that. And I just think that, that's probably going to be a hard conversation to have successfully. I don't know if any of you have any thoughts about that or how to
I don't know why it's a hard
people.
conversation, honestly. I honestly don't. So how much are we talking about? Take whatever your spend is, whatever you want to spend, and divide that by the revenue of the organization. I guarantee you, and then multiply that by $100,000. I guarantee you it's under $20. It's definitely under $100. Like, it's just not a big number. Whatever you're talking about is not a big number. I would say there's always money for the things that are important. So if you're not getting the money, you haven't framed out what you want in terms that make it important to them. There's just, I just refuse to believe that like every lock can't be picked. Every lock can be picked. Everybody can be convinced, unless it's a stupid idea. And like I'm saying, if you know in your heart of hearts that that whatever this investment you want to get is important for the business and will add value to the business, it then just turns into a framing exercise. And I'm not saying that persuasion is easy, but like I'm just saying it's always possible. You always can get around, under, through, whatever impediment is in your way. And I just think we tend to approach these conversations from a risk-only perspective. Well, we don't want to get fined. That's not sexy. Oh, we don't want to get in trouble. That's not romantic. Nobody who lives in a pool of risk, who CFOs live in risk. They're always forward casting. They're always putting out budgets that they know aren't going to get hit. The board is underwriting to M&A where they don't know if the financial models that justify the acquisition are actually going to come true. They're living in that risk. So risk for somebody who's not as risk-minded or who has a different risk appetite is not necessarily going to be as animating. But again, back to what Melissa said, like if we can put that in terms that they care about, if we can speak their language and we can connect how this tool is actually going to translate into what they care about, their corporate level objectives being achieved in a faster, a higher expected value way, that's what the path is. But again, I just think we end up relegating ourselves, or we go into those conversations expecting that outcome. We go into those conversations like it's just not a valid argument that we don't have money. Any company that has 100, 200, 20,000 employees, like there's always money for an extra $100,000 here or an extra $50,000 there or an extra $30,000 there. Like there just always is money there. That's changing the couch for an organization.
James and Melissa, any thoughts along these lines too?
I think it's a little harder than that because that CFO has got every department in the company, making that same. It's just 30 grand. It's just another 100 grand. Come on, we got money. And so then you've got to compete against all those other ideas. And then at the same time, the CFO, good CFO, is looking for ROI on everything. Where's the ROI on this? And so from our dynamic, the difficult thing is, the reality is that we're saving a little bit of time from a lot of different people. So a lot of, I've had many of these conversations. It's like, well, how many headcount are you going to cut? Give me the badge number. And so it's hard with these GRC systems because you're not cutting a badge number, you're cutting a slice off of everybody, in the sense of making it easier for them to either manage the risk or control the issue and the probability of, which, specific surprise are we going to avoid. And so that's the dilemma that we have to deal with as compliance and GRC, advocates. And so, how I've done it before is, you start with your core, oversight governance groups. If we can get away from these spreadsheets, it makes our lives somewhat easier. And then there actually are a couple of headcount we may be able to cut or be able to manage more risk than otherwise. And then you look at the different regulatory frameworks that the CFO does care about. And you talk about how you're going to be able to limit the risk that there's a surprise or an issue. And so all these different components come into play in terms of what that elevator pitch is. Nick's on point that there's, we can't step away from advocating, and there's that message that will resonate. We just got to figure out what that message is. And so all the way back to the beginning of our hour today, I mentioned, I started out saying Sarbanes-Oxley got shut down. Then I said ERM and got shut down. And we happen to be a heavily regulated government organization. And I said, well, we can deal with all the compliance risks. And they're like, oh, yeah, go buy one. So I know that it's the same piece of technology. You're just using it in slightly different ways. And so it's just a matter of finding what resonated. And even then, I had to show the headcount cut, ROI from. We partnered with IT, cybersecurity, and audit and compliance, and between the three of us, we came up with an ROI message. So it takes time and effort, but you gotta work through it.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, you can't say like, well, this is just how I kind of go through life. Like, I'm not going to accept that. Like, there has to be a way to put it in an ROI framework. If it's actually good for the business, right, then we should figure out, like, there's got to be some way to kind of frame it up for the CFO who cares about our ROI, or frame it up for the board who cares about, EBITDA expansion or multiple expansion for the business. Like, there's just always a way to put it in those terms. And what I've seen is that most of us sort of stop at the first no, and most of us stop, if it's like, sometimes you got to wiggle that key a little bit. Sometimes you got to wiggle that key in the lock to get it unlocked. You know what I'm saying? And I mean, right, to your point, so fine, you got to get with IT and you got to slate it this way, or you got to find some more heads. Like, it's just a framing exercise, and we're going to stay stuck in the old way if we keep accepting the no from the CFO. We just are.
I think another way to frame it is similar to like a financial statement. A lot of times they'll invest in technology because it takes too long to close the books. So how long is it taking us to put our information together? And you could argue that the velocity of risks and the pace of risks is increasing. So you're not even providing them timely risk information. And you could almost argue to a point, depending on how disaggregated you are, that it could be almost negligent to, and now you've got their attention. Exactly. But, when you quantify that with the amount of investment, and now you've got ESG, and then you got the G and the governance and the emphasis on G there's a lot of different tentacles that could get them motivated.
There's a lot of different, to your point, there's a lot of different components that we can leverage to make an argument. To your exact point, Melissa, I agree 100%.
Yeah, a CFO is going to resonate with it takes too long to close the books, because that's just headcount and cost and time that people could be doing something else. So that's a great, add to the argument.
Right. All right. Well, we are at the end of the hour. So this has been a great
I feel like we were just getting going. I feel like we were just getting started here.
Maybe someday we could have a follow-up. We got a couple of people asking for a whole session just on how to structure and prioritize risks and what's your methodology there. There's a lot more we could do, but Melissa Musser and James Rose, you gave us plenty to think about and covered an awful lot of ground for us. And thank you to everybody who's been chiming in on the attendee chat too. Nick, I'll let you wrap it up and take it home.
Over 3,000 emojis. So great to be back, you guys. James, Melissa, thank you guys so much for joining us. Matt, you're phenomenal as always. I hope you guys can join us next week because we're going to have a great session. We got who all's on? It's me, you, Matt, Hema, and Christy Grant Hart, and we're going to be talking about post-election breakdown, E&C and HR's next 4 years. So this is going to be a session you are not going to want to miss. It's going to be a lot of fun. See you guys next Thursday. Coolest place to be every Thursday. So glad you're back. And by you, I mean me. See you guys soon.
Thanks, Nick.